All right, so you've got a lead. Here's a mistake that you could easily make. You don't get the contact info. When I hear someone say, hey, I got this great story. This thing happened to Lee. I think you should hear it sometime. In that moment, I'm asking, could I call them? Could I call that person? Can I call Lee? And if the answer is yes, I'm just like, can I have his phone number? Because here's what happens if you don't do that in the moment. There's going to be a moment later where you're like, oh yeah, I could have thought I want to call Lee. So I text my friend. I'm like, hey, remember Lee's story? And maybe that person isn't around or they're out of town or whatever. And I'm just like, can't get a hold of them. Or I'm like, can I get their number? And maybe they're on vacation for 2 weeks or whatever. And so it's just going to elongate that amount of time. And maybe I kind of want to get into it. So that's one reason to get the contact info right there and to get permission to be able to call the person. The other reason is if it's a good lead, even if you don't feel like right now you're going to share a story, you should go ahead and follow up on it. I would call Lee anyway and say, hey, Lee, I hear you got a great story. I just want to hear about it. Look, I don't really have a story to share or a moment to share a story right now, but you never know. Something could come up. And then when you're in a meeting, when I'm in a meeting and somebody says, hey, we need a great story of life change, maybe something has to do with a relationship or hopelessness, I could be like, already on it, got it. I talked to Lee the other day and he's got this great story. So to recap that, when you hear a good story lead, a story of change, go ahead and get that contact info right then and ask the person who tells you the story, hey, would it be okay if I called that person? Sometimes the person will say, sure, here's the number. Let me give them a heads up and then you can give them a call. From there, what am I doing on that first call? Well, first, let me just say, you got to make the call. So, this is. I realize that a lot of people have a little bit of a harder time calling people. It kind of feels like a cold call. Look, get the courage, muster it up, and just make a phone call. Let me tell you what I say, and maybe this will help you out a little bit. I called Lee, and I said, hey, Lee, I'm friends with Brian. Brian gave me your number. And I am super into stories. I tell a lot of stories at our church. And I just I heard this awesome story about what God has done in your life. And would you have time to tell me your story just like for 15 minutes or something? Doesn't have to be right now. We could schedule a time later. Or, would you be into that? 100% of the time. I've never had anybody turn me down. 100% of the time, people want to tell me their story. People love talking about themselves. I love talking about myself. I would love to share my story with you. So he's like, yes, I'll tell you right now. I'm in the car. Most of the time, they'll tell you right then. But other times they'll say, yeah, can I call you right after work? So it's just like, great, I'll call you. What are you doing in this conversation? You really just want to get an overview of the story, just kind of an outline. And so I'm intentional. I say, give me the 15-minute version of your story. So Lee, just for 15 minutes, talked to me about his story and kind of told me where he was. I'm looking for that change again. So where he was, what happened, what God has done in his life, and where he is right now. I'm getting like the bullet points of the story. And again, based on the idea of detail and reflection, he's going to share a lot of external details with me. That's what people do. But I'm going to ask him, like, what do you feel like God has done in your heart? So I'm at least going to get one big reflection, one big piece of emotion or feeling, the way he felt throughout his story. I'm going to write it down. Okay. I'm just going to write it down in my notebook. A couple of things. Lee was a pastor, felt called of God, wanted to be a great man of God, had an affair, ended up hopeless. But now his marriage is awesome. God has saved his marriage and is never been closer to God. God has totally transformed his life. I'm writing those things down. You're going to forget them, so you should write them down. At the end of the conversation, I say, Lee, dude, that's an incredible story. Look, I don't know if we can share it. I don't know how we would share it. I don't know when, but I know that I love your story. Hey, would you be okay if I shared this story with like a couple other members of my team? Would that be okay if I told Chris or Gary or something like that? And if he says yes, then I'm like, great. I'll probably talk to him about it. And let me just say, look, like I said, I don't know how or when we could share the story, but I know that I might be calling you again one day. It could be soon, or it could be a year from now. And but I hope to talk to you again soon. He's like, great. So what have I done there? I've kind of wrapped up the call, but I haven't made any promises, okay? Because I don't know if we're going to be able to share it. I don't know. Until I talk to Pastoral Ministries, I don't know if I got the green light. I don't know if it works for our service. I There's a lot of things I don't know that I'm not in control of, but I did my job. I got the story. I connected with him. And if we're going to share his story, I've established the relationship so that later on I can tell his story at the appropriate time.